Good afternoon, and welcome to Exploring a Culture of Fairness, Respect, and Anti-Racism in Health Professions Education through an Accreditation Lens. I am Dr. Tanya Smith-Bryce. I am Vice President of Education for the Council on Social Work Education. And I chair this work group that put this session together, along with my amazing co-chair that you'll hear from a little bit later on, Dr. Rick Baker. But the purpose of this workshop is to explore shifting institutional structures for improving diversity, equity, and inclusion, and eliminating racism, and specifically anti-Black racism in health professions education. This work group was pulled together back in the summer of 2021 to begin taking on this daunting task of how do we eliminate racism, and specifically anti-Black racism in health professions education. This group is made up of folks who run the entire life cycle of the academic world, from graduate student all the way through to assistant professors, associate professors, full professors, and deans. And a couple of us who represent our national associations. But as we will begin grappling with this concept of how do we eliminate racism in health professions education, we developed 3 buckets. The first bucket being creating a safe space to engage in even the discussion. What kind of language do we use in order to truly understand and be able to grapple with this concept of anti-racism and specifically anti-Black racism? The second bucket is accreditation. What role does accreditation play in addressing anti-racism in health professions education? And our third bucket is around how do we measure anti-racism? How do we measure this in our curriculum, in our programs, in our institutions? And so today, we will begin our discussions around the role that accreditation plays. I hope that you are inspired by what you hear. Please, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. But without further ado, I want to introduce to you Dr. Rick Baker. He is, as I said, it says vice chair on the agenda, but he actually is the co-chair of this committee. He is Vice Dean for Medical Education and Professor of Ophthalmology at Wayne State University School of Medicine. Rick?
Thank you, Dr. Bryce. I'm also excited. Given the broad scope of this challenging topic and the fact that our audience is at different levels of knowledge and understanding, I'd like to present 5 foundational points. These points are admittedly aspirational, but hopefully will be useful in facilitating a common understanding of the topic at hand, and also a more focused and intentional discussion. First, I'd like to make a clear distinction between DEI and anti-racism. DEI is extremely important, but the focus of our planning committee and its activities is anti-racism. DEI enhancement may be a pathway to or platform for anti-racism. However, progress related to DEI should not be substituted or conflated with achievement of goals related to anti-racism. Secondly, I want to point out that race is not a biological construct, it is a social construct. Race as a biological construct is a pervasive and strongly held but inaccurate belief and assumption. Science has definitively demonstrated that race is not based upon meaningful biology. It is at best a poor and often misleading proxy for real biological determinants such as ancestry or genetic predisposition. This misrepresentation, particularly among our faculty and our students, is highly problematic and is the basis for perpetuating false beliefs, misinformation, inappropriate curriculum, and inappropriate care. As my third point, I'd like to emphasize that health inequities experienced by specific marginalized race ethnicity groups are primarily the product and consequences of racism and not race. Racism is a powerful social determinant of health. Despite the undeniably powerful impact of racism, historically, the term racism has been typically de-emphasized, ignored, or actively avoided in discussions related to health. My fourth foundational point is that it's useful to distinguish between structural and institutional racism and interpersonal racism. Discussions, activities, and proposed interventions germane to anti-racism efforts in the health education environment primarily focuses on structural and institutional racism, as opposed to interpersonal racism at the level of the individual. As articulated by authors in our pre-reading, structural racism is a direct derivative of the institution of slavery. It is defined as, quote, the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, and criminal justice, unquote. This includes the processes of racism that are embedded in laws, local, state, and federal, embedded in policies, and embedded in practices of society and its institutions that provide advantages to racial groups deemed as superior, while differentially disadvantaging racial groups viewed as inferior. My fifth and final point sets the stage for the ensuing discussion. We know that structural racism is deeply embedded in all of our society and that it broadly involves numerous characters across multiple institutional platforms. Given the reality that structural racism extends far beyond the educational environment, today's overarching questions are twofold. First, what is the role and the challenges of accreditors in recognizing and dismantling structural racism in the HPE arena? Secondly, what is the role and the challenges of accreditors in mitigating structural racism's pervasive and highly damaging effects on students, faculty, and the patients we serve? Hopefully, these 5 points have given us somewhat of a common understanding and awareness. At this point, I'd like to hand over the program to my illustrious colleagues who will be moderators of the next session. Miguel Pena-Agua, Associate Vice President, National Board of Medical Examiners, and Dr. Lisa Van Hus, owner and executive director of the Ujima Institute. Welcome to my colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Baker, and to Tanya Smith-Bryce for leading off this session. I think I speak for everyone when we're very excited about what we're about to see in this first panel and the folks who will be presenting with us. And without further ado, I think we'll dive right in. We want to make sure that you're all engaged, as was said in the chat. Make sure you're asking your questions and being active for those of you out there. And we're going to start off with Megan Fujita, who's the Executive Director of the Social Work Accreditation at the Council on Social Work Education. She will start us off.
All right, thank you so much. Let me just always have to get the screen situated so you can see everybody. I hope everybody's doing well today. I'm Megan Fujita. I'm the Executive Director of Accreditation at the Council on Social Work Education. Thank you all for having me today. And so we can go to the first slide. The way I've structured this presentation today, we've got about 8 minutes here. I would like to talk about our educational policies and accreditation standards in social work education. And so you'll hear me refer to the EPOS many times during this presentation. I'm referring to the educational policies and accreditation standards. And so what those are really made up of competencies, which are sort of our student learning outcomes, what we expect students to demonstrate upon graduation to enter social work practice. Those are also our educational policies, sort of bigger picture statements and theories that inform our accreditation standards, which are what we ask programs to do on the ground. And so when I say the word EPOS, We're really talking about all of these. And so we update our EPOS document every 7 years at the Council on Social Work Education. And so I'm going to just walk sort of a little bit through history, where we are now, and where we're headed in terms of anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in our accreditation standards. And so if we go to the next slide, I'm going to start with a look back first. So 2 slides on our 2008 EPOS, which is not the one we're currently in, but our most recent set of standards and educational policies. And so what I've done here is just pulled this competency out. Again, the competency is what we ask students to know, value, skills upon graduation to enter social work practice. And so within our 2008 standards, there was really a focus on formation of identity, a person's life experience, demographic factors, and identities around diversity. And if you go to the next slide, our educational policies and our accreditation standards for the 2008 EPOS. So again, the educational policy is sort of that big picture statement that informs the accreditation standard on the ground that programs discuss when they submit self-studies to our Commission on Accreditation, who makes decisions about programs. Really here, it's very similar. So we have sort of how are programs thinking about diversity in the learning environment, but really about supporting people with diverse identities, and really at that individual level of diversity, meaning almost numbers that we were looking for at that point in time. And so if you go to the next slide, we're going to zoom forward a little bit, and I call this one a look around, because these are the current standards that we are in right now. They were written in 2015. We're kind of on the last year of these standards about. We shifted in 2008 to 2015 to look a little bit more at system levels. So we're thinking about micro, meso, macro levels of practice, thinking about formation of identity, but now we're also talking about oppression, poverty, marginalization, and alienation. We're thinking about power and privilege a little bit more. So transitioning less from the individual to more about perhaps systems of privilege and power. And if you go to the next slide, we are also still asking programs about, and what does this look like in your learning environment, right? We're talking about cultural humility now. We're talking about, do you have specific and continuous efforts in your learning environment that model and affirm respect for diversity and difference, more so based on those micro, meso, and macro levels of practice. Okay, and if you go to the next slide, we're going to look forward now. So I said every 7 years we revise and review our standards. We are currently in draft 2 of our next set of standards, the EPOS. We're hoping these will be approved in June, but we just got our second round of feedback on draft 2, and so we are quickly looking at the feedback and working on these. However, this has been our biggest shift in terms of this area in our accreditation standards. And so we go from diversity and then diversity and difference to engaging in anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in practice. And so it was a really a different direction and really taking a stronger stand for the Council on Social Work Education in this way. Really calling out and naming what we're talking about here. So the pervasive impact of white supremacy and privilege, talking about anti-racist practice. Still, we have cultural humility, power, privilege, but really asking people to take a critical reflection. And by people, I mean social work students and faculty and staff, to take a critical reflection and have self-awareness around these areas. And if you go to the next slide, so those were that was the competency, right? What we ask students to know, the values, the skills upon graduation. Here's the educational policy and then the accreditation standards that programs speak to. Here, it's very similar about dismantling systems of oppression. I think what's interesting about this slide, so I was giving a talk a few weeks ago about this, and I had a conversation with a woman after from a community college who said, well, I don't know how we would do this. Our community college is in a community that's pretty affluent, mostly white students. And so we had a really great conversation to say, this is all around us. This is the society we live in. This is sort of what our nation was built upon. So it's about thinking about, even in this woman's neighborhood, well, why is that? Could it be redlining? Could it be discriminatory lending practices? sort of looking at systems about why is the world around me the way it is, right? Not just thinking about where you think you would find these things, but realizing it's all over. And so really training social work students to see that and think critically when they enter practice. I do want to say we did receive some feedback about this language, about including white supremacy here, including the word anti-racism. We feel very strongly about that in order to, it's almost impossible to have a thought without having the language to think about that. And so really having the language leads to the thoughts, which leads to the conversation, which leads to action around this. And so if we view anti-racism as something very action-oriented, we need to name it and we need to use the words and the language around it. And we need to do that with our students and with the faculty as well. And so if you go to the last slide, when we think about implementation, I was thinking about implementation, opportunities, limitations, but they all kind of blended together, to be honest. And so professional development around this area is going to be one of the most important things for implementation in social work education and in social work accreditation. And so one of the issues perhaps is that based on some of the feedback we've received in these standards, there's perhaps a lack of understanding about what anti-racism is. Some people gave feedback that said, well, we live in a state where this could be problematic. There are bills about critical race theory entering our state house, state senate. In nowhere in the educational policies or accreditation standards was any specific theory or anything like that mentioned, and we were very intentional about that. And so really we think we need to provide professional development opportunities for faculty, not just students, but the faculty who would be having conversations in the classroom. And that leads to also the lack of agreement. Well, we live in a society and a world where people don't even agree that racism exists, right? And so really, how do we move that conversation forward within the social work profession and within social work education in that way? And so the hope is that by having these conversations, hopefully, in maybe a few iterations of standards, we could focus on more collective issues like economic justice or global preservation or things like that. And so with that, I will hand it back to our wonderful moderators. But please, if you have any questions, let me know. It's been a pleasure to be here today, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan. And I just want to make a brief comment about how inspiring the work that you and the Council on Social Work Education are doing, and considering the critical importance of your profession and bridging some of these gaps for our patients and the folks we care for. To hear words, these verbs are words on a page until you implement them and you hold programs accountable. Engage in practice, very important words. We're not just talking about thinking about it or appreciating it. You need to be doing it on the ground when you're rolling up your sleeves in your setting. And I hearing and reading words in your presentation regarding explicit and implicit curriculum, and recognizing that they both exist, even at the level of the accreditor, so incredibly important for this very, very important topic. So thank you for that. And I hope others that are struggling with this with your own programs, no matter what profession you're in, or other accreditors in there can certainly take a lot from your presentation, Megan. I think the ones that follow as well. So two housekeeping things I'll mention before we move on to our next speaker. First of all, do not engage in the chat necessarily, but use the Q&A feature. We're seeing some questions coming in and some comments. Please keep doing that. Keep engaged with our speakers and our panel. I will also say that I'm introducing folks, and my colleague is also doing so. But in the packet, the full bios of everyone, both from the planning committee, your moderators, as well as the speakers, are in the packet. So please refer to those for more information. So next, we're going to move on to Laura Rassar-King from the Council on Education in Public Health, and she is the executive director of the Council on Education for Public Health, and she will talk about the efforts in her organization.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Laura Rassar-King, and I'm the Executive Director of the Council on Education for Public Health. Today I'm going to present where my agency has been over time regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we are going in the future, and what I think it takes to advance on the journey. Next slide. So first, a brief introduction to my agency. CEEF accredits 227 schools and programs of public health offering degrees at the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral levels. CEEF was founded in 1974 as an independent agency with two corporate members, the American Public Health Association and the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. The relationship with those organizations is not one of control, but one of partnership, which I think is important to this discussion. Next slide. Like all accrediting agencies, CEEF has criteria that set standards of performance for schools and programs that we accredit. The criteria cover elements related to curriculum, research, service, faculty, students, program evaluation, and a variety of other related higher education issues. Incorporating elements related to diversity, equity, and inclusion is not new to us. In fact, our criteria have referenced these since our founding almost 50 years ago. Although, of course, the language has changed over time to reflect the times. So taking you through, in 1975, our criteria referenced non-discrimination. In the early 80s, it referenced equitable opportunities for faculty and students. In the late 80s, the words affirmative action appeared. In the early 90s, emphasis was placed on recruitment, retaining, and promoting diverse faculty and student body, and ensuring equitable opportunities for all faculty and students. And in 2011, requirements were added around teaching and practicing cultural competence. In the early years, the language was really focused on the people, or more of a representation focus. In more recent years, those expectations have expanded to include not only representation, but also training and a community engagement focus as well. Next slide. In 2016, CEEF conducted a major revision of its accreditation criteria. In fact, it was the largest change in the accreditation criteria in almost 100 years. In this version, there's a separate criterion for diversity and cultural competence that applies to the entire school or program and has many elements. It's excerpted on the slide that you see. DEI was also incorporated into the curriculum through required competencies for the first time. I'll show you those in a moment. As you can see, what CEEF currently expects is systematic, coherent, and long-term efforts to incorporate elements of diversity. And this term is used broadly here. This criterion is much longer. This is just a piece of it. But incorporate systemic, coherent, and long-term efforts into all aspects of the school and program, including faculty, staff, students, curriculum, scholarship, and community engagement. It references the learning environment and competencies. And although the required documentation does not appear in the slide, it also requires the program to monitor its climate related to DEI through faculty and student feedback. Next slide. These are the competencies that reference the elements of DEI most directly. Our process requires programs to teach and assess students on all competencies, and our site visit teams assess the extent to which this has been accomplished. So it's very granular. We expect to see all of these areas addressed and also assessed when we're reviewing curricula. I think most notable here is competency number 6, in which we call out racism by name, which seemed very forward-thinking at the time and honestly a little bit risky at the time. But as we know now, it may not go far enough. Next slide. So while I would love to see the day when we refer to health inequities and racism in the past tense, we're nowhere near that yet, and the journey does continue. In 2021, a subcommittee of our council worked on a red line of our 2016 criteria and will propose additional language related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism through the criteria. This is a different approach than what we have typically used, where the expectations apply to all areas but are bundled into one standard. The approach that we are considering currently makes references and lays out expectations in nearly every criterion that we have, whether it relates to faculty research, to student advising, to teaching practices, or to student recruitment, or anything in between. We'll continue this work into 2022, and we'll engage stakeholders from every part of our field for feedback on this approach. Next slide. While my organization is still working on this, and we are far from perfect or even done, we have had some success in this area. In reflecting on what facilitated our success, it does not start with accreditation. It starts with the field and its core values and vision. The field of public health and its leading organizations acknowledge that racism is a public health crisis, and they have vowed to do everything they can to dismantle it. Without this commitment among the field, accreditation can only do so much. I included the figure on the right to illustrate the items that lie above and below the waterline. We tend to think that we get things done with policies, procedures, and structures. And accreditation is full of policies and procedures. But how we really get things done is by shared assumptions, beliefs, values, and norms. Those must be underlying principles for progress to be made and to last. I'll leave you with a few parting thoughts. What accreditation can do is, number one, ensure a minimum level of acceptable performance based on the standards that are set out. And number two, expect continuous quality improvement. Our programs are never done. They know that they have to get better no matter where they were the last time. What accreditation cannot be or do, it cannot be the conscience of the profession. The best way to move ahead is through collaboration with partners in the field, including practitioners, faculty, students are huge advocates and are wonderful to work with, as well as organizations in the field. Start where they are and begin to build. Next slide. I'm happy to talk with anybody after this about what we have done in public health and what we are currently doing. So please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. And thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Dr. Rossar King. That was really inspiring. I will actually invite Laura and Megan, if you wouldn't mind turning your cameras on. I've been given a bit of artistic license by the forum leads. We do have a little bit of time, and I'm just blown away by what you've both told us so far about the work you're doing. I just want to reflect briefly on what you said, Laura, that racism as a public health crisis. Racism as a public health crisis. We should be saying that everywhere. That should be on billboards. That should be on T-shirts. And how powerful for you to have that as sort of an underlying premise of your accreditation standards. And as you said, do we go far enough in many of these things? But as you said, accreditation is a minimum standard. If we make that in itself and in its essence a minimum standard, boy, we've come a long way even now. But still, a continuous process improvement has to be happening. We need to keep moving. I would like to ask you both each a question, if you wouldn't mind. And I think, again, sort of reflecting on your journey to this point, both of you had in your last slide some of the challenges you had. You had mentioned, Laura, that this doesn't go far enough, but obviously, and Megan, you had mentioned, based on where people are working, based on their state, you come across some questioning and maybe even some resistance. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of suggestions you would make to others struggling with this or others early in their accreditation process, just starting on this journey, some lessons learned, maybe one or two things from each of you? And maybe I'll start with Megan.
Sure, yeah, thank you for that question. I'm trying to quickly narrow my thoughts down to maybe two quick takeaway points, but my first thought is, there's a time and a place to meet people where they are, and there's a time and a place to really say it's time to pull people along, right? And so I think figuring out what that balance looks like, because when it comes to people's dignity and justice and people's safety, people who really are perhaps against that in certain groups of people, it's not best to meet people where they are all the time in that way. And so that's really the stance and position we're taking on this, in terms of using that language and saying this is the direction that we're heading. And the second thing that I think is, just a comment about social work in general. Social workers enter communities. They work with people, organizations, structures, systems. Damage can be done at that level. And I think, as a profession, we are really trying to hold ourselves accountable as well and say, how have we been complicit in this historically, and how do we move forward as a profession as well?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And it makes me think that you and your organizations are not going to comfortable places with some of this. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. At least that's my opinion. And bravo to you for the work you're doing. Laura, I'll ask you to also add any comments.
Yeah, I think, my answer to that question, my agency does a lot of professional development for the schools and programs that we accredit. So we hold a lot of webinars, we do consultation that's in addition to just the evaluation that we do. So we really look at it as a development process. And really, I'm going to go back to the idea of partnerships, because a lot of the success that we're able to have is really working in partnership with other public health organizations. So if we identify that there is an area that the schools are struggling with, it's not only coming from us, it's also coming from our partners, and it can come from them and maybe from a different angle or in a different way than it's coming from us. So I think for me, it really is about those partnerships.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, and for those words of advice for those that are starting on this journey as well. Wonderful work, Laura and Megan. I think at this point, we will now move on to our next two speakers. And first up, we'll have Teresa Schellenberger, who is the Executive Director of the Nursing Education Accreditation. And I will turn the podium over to Teresa.
Thanks, Miguel. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to discuss this really important topic. I'm so happy to see so many people attending today. As he said, my name is Teresa Schellenberger, and I'm the Executive Director of the National League for Nursing, Commission for Nursing Education Accreditation, or CNEA. Next slide, please. I thought it would be helpful for some context to give you a little bit of background about the work that we do so that you can understand the perspective that we bring. So since 2013, when CNEA was formed, we began accrediting nursing programs across the educational spectrum. So we work with programs and faculty from LPN, LVN education, all the way through clinical doctorates. We are still relatively new in the accreditation world, and so we don't have a long history like some of the other organizations. We are making progress and including DEI information into our standards and as part of our review, but we haven't incorporated quite to the extent the other organizations, some of the anti-racism information, but we are beginning those conversations. We have conducted pre-accreditation or initial accreditation for over 115 nursing programs so far. So CNEA really promotes excellence and integrity in nursing education through a process that respects diversity of the program mission, curriculum, students, and faculty. So it really is about respecting that diversity of all of those people involved. And like some of the others, our emphasis really is on a culture of continuous quality improvement. So we too are trying to apply some of those things to the work that we do. Next slide, please. All the work that we do related to accreditation is really grounded in the core values that we use. And those core values are caring, diversity, integrity, and excellence. And for this discussion, I'm really going to focus on diversity, as that's really essential for our work. We value a culture of inclusive excellence and demonstrate respect for all of those program types and those within the program. We recognize that one size does not fit all. Although diversity was already a key aspect of our work and in our values, the Future of Nursing report really propelled us to make an even more specific focus and direction in our standards and in our quality indicators that guide accreditation. The CNEA mission and values are embedded in our 5 accreditation standards, and I'm going to spend the rest of my time providing a little more of a glimpse of how those support diversity and our movement to anti-racism. As I said before, we're on the trajectory, but we're not quite there yet, and we're hoping to move forward. Next slide, please. So one of our standards focuses on faculty, and that really is an emphasis on the culture of excellence in caring. So as part of that accreditation standard, we expect programs to demonstrate that faculty have diverse backgrounds, that the organization supports inclusivity, and that programs attempt to recruit and retain diverse faculty. Does this always happen? No, we know that it doesn't. But there should be part of the process that's really helping them to improve. For this standard, there are a few quality indicators that address some of these DEI concepts. One of those areas is student services. Student services need to be culturally responsive and inclusive, and that they meet the diverse needs of our students. And we really look at diversity in its broadest sense. So we have not limited it to a particular area or group. Programs need to show evidence of ongoing review and revision of those student services and making sure that they truly are meeting those needs of those learners and helping them achieve success. Programs may offer exemplars of strategies that they use that foster a culturally responsive learning environment and that demonstrate inclusivity of diverse learners. Support of students is obviously expected of faculty, but we know within nursing, our students are working with lots of others in the healthcare setting. And so we expect preceptors who are working with students in our clinical facilities, that they too should be supportive of those diverse students and facilitate their learning. And again, if they're not meeting this, that they have quality indicators and action plans so that they can move forward to address this. Next slide. Standard 4 focuses on a culture of excellence in care. This standard requires that the learning environment is supportive of those diverse students and enables them to achieve academic success in student identity formation. The program's commitment to acting in the best interest of students and creating a caring, culturally responsive learning environment needs to foster that success and empower those students. Those student services are so important to making sure that the students have the needed support and areas that will allow them to progress and grow. Next slide, please. Thank you. The final standard is focused on the culture of learning and diversity. And this focuses on curriculum and evaluation processes. The program curriculum should provide growth opportunities and support. And so that really means that teaching, learning, and evaluation process needs to consider those diverse learning needs. Quality indicator 5C suggests that the program's culture of learning and the implementation within the curriculum and in those teaching, learning, and evaluation strategies need to be evident so that we are creating that positive learning environment with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide. Another one of our quality indicators also focuses on curriculum. The program needs to offer an up-to-date curriculum that reflects those current and emerging social and healthcare trends. This quality indicator specifically expects students to be taught about timely issues such as health equity, social determinants of health, and population health. And that education needs to occur not only in the classroom, but in the lab and the clinical situations in which students are practicing. We think this is an important first step in addressing some of the issues that are confronting society. We believe that this should help enable us to make that progress and give students opportunities to engage and understand these issues. Next slide. Sorry, we must have, if you can go back one more, thank you. Lastly, the experiential learning or clinical experiences, which are such an important part of nursing education, should provide that opportunity to demonstrate culturally responsive care to diverse and vulnerable populations. To summarize, the work that we do at CNEA to eliminate racism and other disparities is rooted in our mission and our values of the organization. They really drive the standards and the work that we do to promote equity and quality. We are making progress, but further work is certainly needed. As you can see, our main focus right now has been on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we are moving toward addressing anti-racism, and we need to reflect that in our own quality improvement. We need to work on training our volunteers, from our site visitors to our committees to our boards, so that they will understand these issues better and can embrace the work ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. That was very inspiring. I wrote down one thing you said that I think will also go in the pantheon of quotes of the day, along with racism is a public health crisis, and that is not quite there yet. And I feel like everybody on this panel could probably say the same thing regarding where they are in accreditation. That's one of the wonderful things about this, that we're never quite there yet with this discussion. I'd be interested to hear you comment a little bit on something that I thought was really powerful in your standards, which is related to recruitment and retention of diverse faculty. And certainly across the health professions, this is a struggle for all of us, in the sense that if we don't have mentors and preceptors that look like us, we're less likely to enter the profession to begin with, let alone stick around through a career journey. And I'd be interested to hear how you came to that and any thoughts you have.
Certainly, thanks. That's a great question. Obviously, within nursing, we are a very homogeneous group for the most part. We have started to incorporate a variety of diverse individuals, but it's still an ongoing issue. And so we are really working with programs to try to think about what kind of strategies will work to recruit. And it's not just about the recruitment, it's also about the retention, because we know when individuals that are not like everyone else there come to an organization, sometimes they're not accepted, they're not welcomed, they're not treated the way they need to be treated to retain them. And so, you know, we really want programs and faculty to take a look at what they're doing. And as I said, it's not that it's going to change overnight. We know that that's going to be a slow process. But if they don't have that diversity, that they have an action plan in place for how they're going to move forward. And even if that action plan doesn't work, they need to continue to evaluate that and say, okay, that strategy didn't work. We need to move forward. What else can we do? How can we make this better?
Certainly a tall order, but
Yeah.
a standard by which we should expect to be aspiring, and that's great work. Teresa, thank you for you and the work you do with the commission. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. William McDade, who's the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, or ACGME. Dr. McDade.
Thank you, Bill. So the ACGME, and I'll go to the next slide, is a little bit different than the other organizations which had responsibility for both the learner as well as the institution. The ACGME basically provides an assurance function to the public. And the way it works, along with the member boards of the American Board of Medical Specialties, is that the ACGME ensures that the program that trains the physicians meets standards that are consistent with the confidence that the trainee is competent. The ABS member boards alternatively test the individual to ensure that they've completed a training program in a qualifying specialty and that they're capable of personally practicing competently. And that program has to have been an ACGME accredited program. And licensure is yet another way to ensure the public that, that there's professional behavior after the training period of that individual physician is complete. Next slide. So accreditation from the ACGME actually provides a certain lever for individuals within medical education and institutions. ACGME accreditation is associated with payments for resident education from the Center for Medicaid and Medicaid Services and from the Special Appropriation for Children's Hospitals. So you must train in an ACGME accredited program in order to receive board certification or be able to sit for your board certification exam, which is an essential part of that process for the individual physician. And so there are very high stakes involved in receiving accreditation from the ACGME. Non-compliance has significant consequences for both individuals and institutions when the institution, the program, doesn't meet ACGME requirements. Next slide. So the ACGME board worked to change its mission statement to really reflect the idea that the elimination of health disparities, which is now consistent with the improvement of health that has always been part of the mission of the ACGME, is now focused on thinking about how we can help the GME community drive this initiative. And so one of the ways that we can do it is by advancing work in diversity. That the fact is that there's not the expertise and experience per se that may exist within the GME community already. And so there's an education piece, a formative element that the ACGME is now embarked on to address this. And our mission statement has actually changed to accommodate that. Now, it's very much akin to what we did 10 years ago with the CLEAR program, the Clinical Learning Environment Review program, in which we recognized that the GME community wasn't ready yet to move with the expertise to quality improvement in the way that a physician should have in their education. And so the education piece has been added to our mission to reflect that it's not just accreditation, but it's also education that the ACGME is engaged in to help the GME community to advance this work. The board also changed the mission statement last summer to include explicitly diversity and inclusion as part of the overall vision it has for an evidence-based, data-driven clinical learning and care environment defined by excellence in clinical care, safety, cost-effectiveness, and professionalism. And the strategy in our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at ACGME is to educate physicians who are more likely to serve in underserved areas and to serve underserved patients in the hopes that this will increase access to care, improve trust, and communication and outcomes for those most at risk for health disparities. And thus by increasing or decreasing the health disparities, improving health and population health. Next slide. So part of that education piece that the board has really focused on resulted in our creation of Equity Matters. And Equity Matters is a continuous learning and process improvement initiative in diversity, equity, and inclusion for GME that's been put out by our office in ACGME. There are modules on the fundamentals of diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism that are going to be available on our website at learn@acgme at the end of Q2 this year. Next slide. But ACGME, as I said, has been interested in the elimination of health disparities for at least 10 years in the beginning of the Clinical Learning Environment Review, where the Health Care Quality Pathway 5 asked residents, fellows, and faculty to engage in workplace education that deals with the elimination of health disparities, and Healthcare Quality Pathway 6, which asked residents and fellows to engage in initiatives in looking at their own practice data to eliminate health disparities. Now that's health disparities, but the focus here is on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which we think will have an impact, a favorable impact on the elimination of health disparities. So our new program requirement 1C that started 2 years ago enjoins programs and partnerships with their sponsor institutions to engage in practices to increase workforce diversity and to provide for inclusivity. Section 6B6 recognizes that diversity in the absence of an inclusive learning environment is futile. And so this focuses on enjoining programs to provide a civil, equitable, professional learning environment. Section 2A4A10 had been there previously, and it's part of the job description of program directors that asks program directors to ensure that residents who bring complaints forward, concerns forward, are protected from retaliation and intimidation. And Section 5 changes look at the ultimate pass rate as opposed to the first time pass rate, recognizing that this may be a better way of assessing quality in physicians who graduate from our nation's programs. Next slide. So Common Program Requirement 1C asks the program in partnership with sponsor institutions to engage in mission-driven, ongoing, systematic recruitment and retention of a diverse workforce of residents, fellows, faculty, senior administrative staff members, and other relevant members of the academic community. Our focus is on race and ethnicity that I've spoken to you about before in looking at the elimination of health disparities, but there are many health disparities across which the axes of identity will cross. And so any production of physicians of a diverse background that are focused on eliminating these disparities are also part of what we'd like to seek out in increasing diversity in the GME environment. Next slide. Program requirement 6B6 asks programs in partnership with a sponsoring institution to provide professional, equitable, respectful, and civil environments that are free from discrimination, sexual and other forms of harassment, mistreatment, abuse, coercion of students, residents, faculty, and staff. Our office has designed instruments to try to extract this information from programs. We have an Office of Resident Services that receives complaints and concerns from residents who've been adversely affected by these elements. And this serves as a way to let us know what those environments are like that our diverse residents are entering, because the imposition of diversity into an environment that's not prepared for it will really surface the problems that have historically occurred in trying to seek diversity. Last slide. ACGME is driven by its specialty requirements or specialty review committees. And so the common program requirements, which I spoke of, are really incorporated into all of the review committee specialty requirements. Each specialty, though, can add additional elements to address these elements that we're speaking of in terms of DEI and anti-racism. And a number have embarked upon rewriting their requirements now, in which they're incorporating elements of diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. We also have institutional requirements, and these institutional requirements have now aligned with the common program requirements in those same areas addressing DEI and anti-racism. Last slide. So if there are any questions, please feel free to contact me at diversity@acgme.org, and I'll be willing to answer questions. Dr. Panayawa?
Thank you, Dr. McDade. That was inspiring and in some ways gave me a little bit of anxiety as a recovering internal medicine program director myself. I'm very familiar with the ACGME guidelines, and I'm so encouraged what's happened in the past decade, even, and more recently with the work you've done in incorporating some of this language related to DE&I into the requirements. There was one question that did come up regarding the Equity Matters resources and whether or not those were available yet. I know you had mentioned in a prior talk that those were still under construction. Can you comment on that?
They are. So we only began Equity Matters about 7 months ago. The first part of Equity Matters deals with the acknowledgement phase, in which the participants in our learning communities went through a 6-month period of looking at the fundamental areas within DEI, how a learner of one identity or another experiences the GME community, and this covers the waterfront. There are 41 different modules covering each of these elements of identity, and we think provide a fundamental basis for those who are going to begin work in this. What we ask our learning communities to do, and we have 4 sets of learning communities to address this, what we ask them to do is to use reverse ideation. Once you now have this foundation of thinking about how how a person of a given identity will experience the learning environment, we now give you a set of skills to think about. So holistic review, other areas of looking at how to mitigate implicit bias, and various other elements of building a DEI program, DEI offices in your institution. The third phase involves actually putting an idea into action. So what we have combined is the knowledge that we receive from the GME community into a device we refer to as the Equity Matters Collection. 12,000 programs give us information in the annual program update about what they do. We've extracted and kind of aligned them with respect to different topics, and now there are about 52 of those approaches that people have used in the GME community. This should be available on an online resource by the end of 2022. We have a beta version that's ready in PDF form that we've distributed to our learning communities. Our learning communities are going to then use reverse ideation to look at what's wrong with their programs and their environments that impacts adversely the experiences of those learners. And so those modules that we use to set this up are going to be available at Learn at ACGME at the end of Q2. They're now in CME review and osteopathic review for continuing medical education. They're going to be available free of charge on our website. And I think it provides a great basis to get started in understanding diversity, equity, inclusion elements.
Thank you for that. I'm also reminded that before we move on to the roundtable discussion, Dr. McDade will also be, he's been gracious enough to also be part of the roundtable discussion that follows this. I will also at this point invite Megan, Laura, and Teresa, if you want to turn on your cameras, and we'll keep you around, Dr. McDade. And we have time for one other question to think about. And I guess I would ask each of you to reflect on what you've heard from the other organizations and think about words. One thing that's come up as a theme is the power of the words that we're using in many of these accreditation standards. And admittedly, between the four organizations, they're not necessarily the same. Can maybe you reflect a little bit based on what you've heard and also what you might recommend going forward, how you apply these words to accreditation over time and be sure to maintain their relevancy as time goes on, recognizing that these standards are always dynamic and changing. And who would like to go first?
I can begin.
Okay.
So, as I listened to the rest of the presenters, I really came away with that same thought that words are so important and they're so powerful. But I really think we need to push those difficult conversations. When we select words, we seek input from our stakeholders, but sometimes people don't want to have these conversations. They don't want to talk about those difficult things. And so I guess I would say, we need to really be thinking about making sure we're including those diverse participants as part of those conversations so that we can hear those silenced voices and that they can offer a different perspective than just the people that might be on a committee or the people who are drafting those standards. We need to begin those discussions and incorporate a lot of different viewpoints.
Thanks, Teresa. Let's hear next from Laura.
While I agree that words are important, I also have found over many iterations, my agency has had many iterations of criteria around this, but sometimes people can use words, disagreement about using a word or not using a word or using a different word, almost as a way to talk and avoid talking about really what the important issues are. And so I think sometimes you almost have to step back and say, okay, regardless of what we're going to call this thing that we know is right and we all want to do and we can all agree on, what does it look like? What are the behaviors that we're going to see, or what are the outcomes that we're going to see? And then how do you describe that? So, and also I think words become outdated very quickly. And so, so an antiquated word that we have in our standards right now is cultural competence. And it's out of no malice. At the time, we had people who worked in the civil rights community who were on our board and agreed that that was at the time a word that was commonly used. And so now people say, how dare you use, that word? That's not, But words do change, and I think if you focus on the outcomes and the behaviors, in my experience, you move forward.
Those are great points, Laura. And context certainly matters for all of these things. Certainly with the readings we have in the agenda, I learned even more about some of these terms, structural racism, cultural racism, and even individual levels. So the discussion continues. Dr. McDade.
I will just say that certain words 2 years ago, antiracism, actually generated a fair amount of misunderstanding. And it has evolved rapidly in the last 2 years, such that people are quite accepting of it now who would have never been accepting of it 2 years ago. I think that social conditions changed that. I think the stark reality of the things that happened last summer and in the previous years with the murders of individual anti-Black racism, in particular, individuals, really has shed a light on the idea that while diversity is a wonderful concept, that not everybody's affected the same way in our society. And I think that we have to look at the differences that exist there while still embracing the idea that everybody should have a seat at the table, but recognizing that some people have been treated differently than others.
Thank you for that. And Megan, you went first. We're going to give you the last word on the panel. Go ahead.
Sure. I was thinking in 2020, I believe it was 2020, CSW, we developed an anti-racism task force to really think about this and think through sort of how this would be incorporated in standards throughout our policies, throughout curriculum, things like that. And so it was interesting. One of the recommendations was to have a standalone competency about anti-racism. That feedback was heard, but then it was decided to, rather than have a standalone, have it as something sort of infused throughout the competencies, throughout all of them, so that when social workers are engaging in research, when they're intervening, when they're assessing, that is present at all times in one's mind. And so I think standalone language is important, but I also think getting people used to using these words throughout practice, throughout education is incredibly important.
That's a great point, Megan. Thank you so much for that. We have to change the lexicon, and that comes with changing the culture as much as we possibly can, certainly. Wonderful. Please join me in thanking our 4 panelists. We are going to now move on to the roundtable discussion. I will continue to encourage you to put your comments and questions and thoughts into the Q&A section of the platform here, and we'll continue to engage in the discussion. I will now turn it over to my co-moderator, Dr. Lisa Van Hoos.
So I just want to say thank you to the panelists and also to Miguel for moderation. It was an amazing discussion. And so thank you so much for sharing your experiences of where your organizations are in regards to your proactive approaches right now. So I am Dr. Lisa Van Hoos, and I would like to start off with recognizing my affiliation with Baylor University, where I serve as clinical professor in the physical therapy department. I identify as Black, African-American, heterosexual, cisgender, and female, and I use she series pronouns. As you can see, I rock a bald head, y'all, and I am with you from Monroe, Louisiana. Today I'm wearing cheetah print glasses. I've got on an orange and white tie-dye shirt with my favorite orange cardigan. And for today's activities, I'm going to be using my first name, Lisa. So once again, we want to encourage you to keep giving those shout outs in the Q&A, along with any questions that you might have during the roundtable discussion. And so we're going to be asking for each of our panelists to turn on their camera when they introduce themselves and give their response to the first question. And the first question is where are you, and you being your organization, in the process of moving toward eliminating racism in the health profession education? And so Kimberly Moore, we're going to start off with you, representing audiology and speech language pathology.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kimberly Moore, and I am from the Council on Academic Accreditation in Audiology and Speech Language Pathology. And thanks, Lisa, for the opportunity to answer the question. For the CAA, we have been, I guess, talking about specifically about diversity, equity, and inclusion in an intentional way for the past couple of years. In 2020, we actually participated as a council, some of our members and volunteers participated in listening campaigns that were, I guess, sponsored by our parent association, the American Speech Language and Hearing Association, where there were listening campaigns across the profession about some of the specifically racist structures in place and challenges for people in the professions. That provided an opportunity for us as a council just to hear specifically about some of the challenges and hear the challenges, and also gave us an opportunity to explore data. Because for a number of us, we didn't understand what some of the challenges were, specifically around race. So this gave us a baseline understanding of what problems we were trying to address. And so we are not as far along as some of the other accreditors that spoke today in terms of being very specific about criteria and standards. But what we wanted to do was, again, get an understanding of what the problems were. So over the past few years, we have made steps in that direction. One of the things that we did was in 2020, we had a facilitator come in and work with our council to actually go through an exercise, first presenting data about the professions again, so we could get a very good understanding of what was going on, what our role was in addressing challenges specifically related to race. So we went through an exercise where we looked at all of our standards, the different buckets that we have. Our standards are divided into 6 categories, from administration and governance to curriculum to students. And we really looked at where we could address issues. And so we identified several curriculum standards that we felt that we could broaden. We already were talking about equity and inclusion in some of our standards, but we broaden our scope and looking at several of those around our professional practices. So that was kind of the first thing we did that was intentional. Secondly, we thought it was necessary for everybody to kind of get on the same page. We talked about today language and importance of vocabulary and language. We recognize not everybody knew what we were talking about, especially when we talked about diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism. So we went through another workshop where we had an outside facilitator come in and basically give us a crash course on structural inequalities in the US, what that looked like, what that meant specifically for Blacks in America. So that was very, very informative. We required that our commissioners go through that. We've also talked about continuing that series, of that educational series, and working with our site visitors. We have a pool of about 120 site visitors. These are the people who actually go out and verify the information that we've collected to actually do visits to institutions. And so we felt like it was very important for, again, everybody to kind of have a general understanding of what we're talking about, especially when we're asking them to go out and verify some of these new standards that we put in place. So for us, it's a work in progress. We're continuing to learn as we go. We understand that accreditation is a powerful influencer, especially when it comes to influencing priorities within academic programs. As I mentioned, this is an ongoing process for us. We will be continuing over the next year or so to take a deeper dive into our standards and starting to look at other areas as it relates to students, as it relates to faculty and governance. So those are just a few of the things that we've done over the past couple of years to be more intentional about addressing some of the anti-racism challenges that we have in the profession.
Thank you so much. And we thank you for your transparency and also just all of the information that you just shared with us about kind of your development process. So we are very thankful for that information. Now we're going to be bringing in our representative from the American Psychological Association. Thank you so much. And introduce yourself to the group.
Sure. My name is Jackie Wall. I'm with the American Psychological Association. I hold the title of Director of the Office of Program Consultation and Accreditation. And what my role is really comprised of is serving as a liaison to the Commission on Accreditation, which is a 32-member body that accredits programs at the doctoral internship and postdoctoral residency levels in health service psychology. There are, as of the end of 2021, 1,235 programs across those 3 levels that the Commission accredits. So it's a relatively large accrediting body, typically evaluates for periodic review about 250 programs a year. That's pre-pandemic. We operate under a set of accreditation standards, which were developed back in 2012, 2013, 2014, approved in 2015 for implementation in 2017. The language in those standards, which clearly identifies as a foundation understanding and respect for individual and cultural differences and diversity, language that I would subsume appropriate at the time these standards were written, have been in application for the last 5 years. As has been evidenced by many of the comments today, language has changed, the identification of issues in the environment have changed, and the Commission has been giving consideration to whether or not it's time to review their standards, not specifically related to incorporating a DEI or JEDI or aid or anti-racist concepts, but certainly across their standards more broadly. The Commission has been having discussions, is having discussions, will continue to have discussions, because this is not a process, as I'm sure you all are aware, transpires quickly. The one thing that did strike me when I was listening to some of the comments is the Commission, as I would fathom all accrediting agencies, while they hold a level of independence from a professional association or a profession writ large, do have constituents of different members of the profession. And in fact, when policies are revised, they do go through an iterative period of public comment as a method for their development and adoption. I'm not saying that that's an answer, but I did want to put that out for folks to recognize that that certainly is one way to encourage language and communication and ideology as accrediting entities revise their standards. So to cycle back to your question, while yes, the accrediting body that I work to support does have standards written that address differences between people. Do they extend as far as the DEI or anti-racist concepts that have been identified today? The answer is no, but it is a foundation to identify individual variation across society very broadly, to have programs that certainly operate within the context of their mission and the US Constitution to be able to fulfill their mission. But that being said, the education that's required must train professionals to work with broad facets of society equally, that programs must have respect for students and faculty and an environment that is ethical and respects differences among people, such that programs are obligated to attempt to incorporate diversity in their selection of individuals at the student, trainee, faculty, supervisory levels, and to have systems by which they evaluate their success in doing so.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And walking us through your process and also the considerations that your organization is taking into this conversation, and as you're developing your policies and practices. And now we're going to ask for our representative from Nutrition and Dietetics to introduce themselves and also give us an update on where your organization is in the process.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rayana Abisaba, and I am the Assistant Executive Director of the Executive Director of the Accreditation Council for Education in Nutrition and Dietetics. I think ours is a story, and it started at the beginning, all the way up a couple years back, when we just were beginning to work on our standards, with a letter that I received directly from an intern, one of our interns who is in one of our clinical sites, and she was a Black student. And she discussed the microaggressions that they're facing by one of their clinical preceptors. They were very subtle. And I think it made us realize what goes out there, and unintentionally, perhaps, I don't know, maybe intentionally, but what happens, and that moved us into action. Now, our organization, the Academy, was already going into action, but I think as a council of education, that was a major motivator for us, because we figured if this student is facing these issues, we probably have several of them. Our standards at the time had just competencies. As Dr. Fujita said, these competencies are just what the students have to learn, what's in the curriculum. We had nothing else that addressed any diversity, equity, anti-racism, or anything like that. And if you can look at our new standards that were published this fall, we put in thoughtful statements in almost every standard we have to address all elements of our programs. Faculty, training of faculty, training of our clinical and community preceptors, which are our educators, training the students, several elements in the curriculum for the students, admission practices, health and equity, all of this. Now, the interesting thing, when we went for public comments, we received over 1,300 comments from our programs. And we went from very low bar to a very high bar when it comes to this. And I have to tell you, all the comments were congratulating us. They were very positive, and they were pushing us, saying we did not go far enough. So based on the comments that we received, we added health inequity, structural bias, social inequities, health disparities, discrimination. We added gender orientation. So we added just a lot of these based on what our community of dietitians wanted us to do. And I think you'll see that we really strengthen our standards. I do want to address one of the questions that came in, and that's how do you put this into practice? And you know, we believe that you have to walk the walk. Putting them in the standards, unless you walk that walk, I don't know, it's not going to make a lot of difference. So we've, of course, provided trainings, that is great, but we also looked at our data. We looked at our programs. How is the difference between the diversity of our programs in our internships, which is moving from the undergraduate to the practicum sites, includes an application. And we looked at our undergraduate had 30%, or a little bit more than that in terms of the underrepresented minorities. And then our internships had 15, 20%, a drop of 8 to 9%. We provided trainings and webinars, over 6 of them, specifically targeting to the admission practices, the application of our internships. What are they doing that is keeping students out? Specifically our Latinx and our Black students out from their internship. And within a year after providing this, our internships have seen an 8% increase in their diversity. We're very excited about this. We did not see that increase in the other programs. Very, very, very great results. And now we're providing a lot of trainings, noteworthy practices. We're just constantly providing trainings and sharing experiences. And we have one coming where one of our board members, they're having several other Black and African American dietitians come in and share their experiences and make them aware about racism and anti-racism and discuss all of these issues. And that will be our May webinar.
Wow, thank you so much for that story and that example of how, you know, part of this comes from community-based engagement, community-based participatory research. You engage the community, you build something that is community-driven, and you are proof that the results will come. So thank you so much for sharing that story. We're going to have our representatives from pharmacy education turn on their camera and introduce and tell us a little bit about where y'all are at in the process.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'm Mary Kiersma. I'm from the Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education, or ACPE, as you might hear. We have 142 programs that we accredit for the Doctor of Pharmacy program. Currently, we have standards that were approved and started in 2016. We are currently under a revision of those standards that will start in 2025. And so we have put out for public comments and received those comments, and we're working on those to incorporate for our new standards. Just to give you a little bit of background, we probably aren't as far along as many of the other programs are. So we're still working on not only diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also anti-racism. And so we've asked our programs to provide us more information on what they are doing about DEI specifically. But in reading our comments that we've received on the new standards, we realize that we're going to need to go much farther than just DEI. We've heard many comments about anti-racism, cultural humility, and different terms such as that. So we need to look into that as well. Another step that we've taken is we've trained our board members on not only DEI, but also on implicit bias. They were the first ones that were kind of the trial people to start this, and we're planning to train all of our site team members as well. And so those are next steps. Since we have standards that are going to be updated in 2025, we were trying to come up with some way that we could kind of fill the gap in between using the current standards and the new standards. So what we do is we have a list of questions that we provide to our site team members. And we're including some of the questions and some of the things about diversity, equity, inclusion, and we can also include anti-racism in those questions, so that will kind of fill the gap before we have our new standards put out as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that information. And there's this recurrent theme of making sure that we train up our site review team as well. And so we're going to ask for William and Miguel to turn on their cameras. And so Miguel, we saw some of the questions coming in the chat, in the Q&A boxes. Is there anything you want us to take a deeper dive on?
It'd be interesting to hear a little more about the words into actions from others. I like that question that came up from someone who's from speech language pathology, talking about the diversity or lack thereof in the profession, and how do we make the words be accountable to recruit more students of color. And I know that Rayanne touched on this a bit, but I'd be interested to hear other thoughts.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll kick it off and pass it on to others. I think misinterpretation of the words in an accreditation standard can also be problematic. In the language that we had in our Common Program Requirement 1C, we ask programs to increase diversity in their programs. But many people would interpret this as a year-over-year increase in the number of residents or fellows in their programs of diverse backgrounds. What we recognize is that there are not enough medical students in the fourth year to recruit into graduate medical education programs, and that in fact, medical schools have been charged by the Liaison Committee on Medical Education, undergraduate medical education in the allopathic community, to do this for the last 10 years to work with pre-medical learners. But there's been no such stipulation for graduate medical education. And so half of the programs that the ACGME accredits don't have a medical school associated with them. So that gave them a free pass to not involve themselves with pre-residency learners. So what we have now is an opportunity to ask those GME programs to start thinking about people in their first year of medical school as opposed to just their fourth year, people who are in college, people who are in post-baccalaureate programs, people who are in high school and grade school. I think the opportunity to expand the resources that exist at academic medical centers, the barriers that you need to take down so you can access it, so that younger people can access it, and the opportunities to provide mentors, research opportunities, and shadowing experiences can be throughout GME. And I think that's the way that we're going to increase diversity in medicine, at least.
Thank you so much. And I was trying not to do a hallelujah dance as you were speaking, because I was like, right on, totally agree. And so I see Nadim's hand up, and if I mispronounce your name, please take the liberty of correcting me because names are important. And so Nadim, can you turn on your camera and talk to us?
Hi, my name is Nadim Karenbach. I'm the Dean at Tufts University School of Dental Medicine. It's been a pleasure to listen in on you as part of the organizing committee. You know, one of the things we talk about in dentistry is the fact that we've got 6 different kind of broad standards for our dental programs. And it looks like, you know, some of the accrediting bodies are targeting some of the standards. And the standards that we normally target are institutional climate, makeup or diversity of the faculty and or students, introducing the concepts into curriculum, introducing competencies into the clinical settings, et cetera. My question to the group is, what are we thinking about in terms of the structures that are in place that need to be changed, whether it's the admissions criteria, which might have just been mentioned, whether it's in the promotion and tenure guidelines, thinking about that as a structure that needs to be changed. Are any bodies thinking about how to try to impact those structures, so to speak? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a big question. So let's rest and unpack that one. Is there someone that would like to start? I see Megan. Megan, do you have your hand up to contribute to that question?
I do. I don't know, Dr. Moore, if you had your hand up first. I'm happy to go, but I don't want to jump ahead.
You're fine to go first.
Okay, thank you. That's a huge question, and I don't know if I can answer all of that right now, so I'm going to try to take a slice of it, I think. You know, I think this question and some of the others in our conversation, even the way we used to operate, really is asking a question of perhaps how do we increase diversity numbers? How do we increase maybe BIPOC faculty who are achieving tenure or students in our programs? And so I think maybe reframing some of the questions around less about numbers and more about how are we creating inclusive spaces that people want to be a part of. And so that's really how I'm trying to approach a lot of these mission and goal standards that we have, these implicit curriculum standards that we have, even some of the assessment. And so really thinking about opportunities for programs to offer faculty or students to build community within the program so that once students or faculty are part of the program, they're not operating in isolation, right? There's mentorship, there's community, there's fellowship with one another, and sort of thinking through that. And so I think if I just had to narrow it down, it would just be think about how we ask the question perhaps, and really think about what spaces we're creating, because I think those are incredibly important.
Thank you so much, Megan. We appreciate that insight. And so Kimberly, we see your hand up.
Thank you. I agree with Megan. It's such a big, it's such a big question. And I think a part of the challenge is like, where do you start? And what can we impact or change as accreditors? And I think for us, at least for the CAA, one of the things that we have talked about is how do we reduce or mitigate some of the barriers to the professions for us, because we accredit both speech and audiology. And one of the things that we realize, because we have limits, and one of our limitations is data. We just don't have we don't collect a lot of the data as the accreditor. However, our association does, our professional association does, and then there's also an association of academic programs. So I would think maybe about a year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years ago now, we started engaging with kind of our strategic partners in the sense, and talking about just admissions standards and what, if anything, what would our role be, and what would the role of the professional association be, and the role of the association that houses the academic programs. And we had some very good conversations. And I think for us, to answer your question, We haven't specifically identified things that we can do as an accreditor, because one of the things that we do is respect the individual missions and objectives of the programs. And it gets really challenging around something like admissions standards. However, we recognize that there are other people or other organizations and groups in the space that could be very influential. So we've kind of taken the approach from right now is to make sure that we're at the table when our professional association and our association of academic programs had those conversations about some of those structural things that we feel as the accreditor, we may not have much influence over. However, we want to make sure that we are supporting and providing necessary feedback as other entities who might have more influence and maybe more appropriate to influence some of those structures come up with solutions.
Thank you so much. And so I see Rayanne, who's going to be next. And then after that, we're going to pitch back to Miguel to bring forth a question from the Q&A. Rayanne.
Thank you. Whenever you have a large problem, as you know, being a researcher, you have to break it down into small pieces. And I think this is the best way that we have been able to move forward by bringing it, dividing it into chunks that we can address each separately and not getting confused or overwhelmed by the magnitude of the issue and the magnitude of the topic. So, you look at admission and what is it in admission that you can affect at this time, and what are the steps you need to take to help with that. And this is how we address the admission piece. We look at the not having enough, maybe Black individuals in our profession, and that is a major issue for us. So how do we address this? We started looking at the grants and the funding that's available in federal government, and now we're trying to encourage our programs to apply for these grants and funding so that they can go out and recruit students, in these areas that they need to. So look at every issue and address it small piece by small piece. One of the things is, training our program reviewers, of course, just having a specific training only on how to look at a program and look at the diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, equity, all of that for that program specifically. Don't confuse it with too many things because it can get, just too difficult to tackle.
Thank you so much. So thank you for centering us on our intentionality and making sure that it does not become just messy with other topics and distractions. And so, Miguel, we're going to pitch it to you to lead us through some questions from the Q&A.
Thank you. And I do have one that just came up. I think Dr. McDade did answer part of it in the chat, but from Andrea Dayrup, who had mentioned undergraduate medical education is working on increasing diversity. How do you propose we get there with graduate medical education when the medical schools haven't been able to get there despite decades of work? I don't know if you want to comment on what you had said, Dr. McDade.
Well, so what I said was that, we've been working at this for the last 40 years, but we've had some problems with legal challenges. And I think that in part, we're looking at the wrong things. One of the things that we have been looking at heretofore have been standardized tests. And with all due respect to you, Miguel, at the National Board of Medical Examiners, standardized tests don't assess everything that we need to look at in the practitioner. And I was listening to a Malcolm Gladwell podcast a few weeks ago, and he was looking at the end process of lawyerings. So that how do you predict a lawyer who's going to be a rainmaker at a large firm? And can you reverse engineer the process so that you can find those things that those rainmakers have in common that you can then select for before they go to law school, as opposed to using the LSAT, for example? And what they found is that the people who were rainmakers in these law firms had all worked at blue-collar jobs before going to law school. Now, wouldn't it be impressive if we were able to find a set of criteria that helped us identify those things in the physicians that we want? And we could select those people before they got into medical school and maybe target those people to go into medical education training. One of the things I point out is that when you look at what we do for medical students, we ask them to perform on the standardized test, the USMLE Step 1. And those scores have historically been used for residency programs as a filter almost to select students. Now, I know that the National Board 6 years ago, published a paper asking program directors not to use these scores for this purpose. But in fact, this is a practice that many engage in, thinking this somehow is consistent with quality. Well, what I've seen as being an associate dean at a medical school for many years is what you do is you have students who are energized and psyched about being other directed entering medical school. And then around January of their M2 year, they start studying for this exam and you can't find them. And then after that, they go in and they're studying for their shelf exams, for their end of rotation exams for M3. You can't find them again. They're studying for Step 2. You can't find them. And finally, toward the end of medical school, some get back involved with this. But what we've helped to do is to make these people very self-interested. They're not studying necessarily for their patients. I think they're studying for themselves so that they can actually get a better residency program or program where they want to go in geography. And so what we have now are people who are graduates who we've kind of bred, to some extent, the compassion, the empathy out of them and focused the attention on themselves. So I think we've corrupted the process to some degree, and we need to get back to those other things, which is why I was happy that the accreditation standards at ACGME are now trying to emphasize that first time especially board pass rate and look at the ultimate pass rate eventually. And we're collecting data on that right now, but we've now leveled the playing field for pass rate for all specialties, which used to be varied based on the review committee. So I think to minimize those standardized tests, I think we'll find that we can diversify our field, and we'll find that maybe we can have people focus on those missions that the medical school was once trying to imbue in their residents, or in their students and residents, but can't because people are so invested on these standardized exams.
Thank you so much for that discussion and just reminding us that we have both lag and lead indicators that we can look at and making sure that we are engineering our systems to get what we want. So we're going to pivot to another question. And this question is going to be asking each of you to think about one thing that you heard from the panel discussion that may have come from a different discipline and that you're interested in taking back to your organization. Because often as HPE programs, we are insulated, we work in our silos, but we all know that independence is not the goal. The goal is for us to get to a place of interdependence so that we can provide the best and safest product to the public that we serve. And so we're going to start off with Mary. What was something that you heard from the panel discussion that you're like, I need to take back to the Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education?
Well, one of the things that Kimberly was talking about was doing a lot more training, not only of our board, but also of our site team members. I think we're kind of in that first beginning phase, and it seems that she's a lot farther along than we are. And so I would be interested to hear more from her and take that back to not only our board, but to also help with the rest of the staff and setting up training for our site team members.
Thank you so much. And what about you, Ms. Jacqueline?
Well, not to piggyback too much on what Mary said, but I think it's on making the training and evaluation of it more explicit. You know, very interestingly, psychology, I think, in some ways similar to social work, with the difference being psychology tends to focus on the individual that's in front of them, right? And recognizing that even though people may share similar physical characteristics, be completely different, you know, has that as part of its grounding in kind of an idiopathic perspective of seeing the world in a practice setting. But that being said, I think that's led to sort of not recognizing the need to examine, do all of the parties involved, understand the standards, the environment, and how to truly assess to ensure that climate is good and things of that nature. Very quickly, though, I would like to add one other comment that may not have come directly from some of the conversations. In thinking about what an accrediting agency does, I mean, it's really designed to evaluate quality of training, embracing the field that it's representing as a professional accrediting agency. But one of the facets is to really be supportive of innovation in the educational environment. And what I heard from listening to people more broadly is that there are some things being done that may not quite fit the old mold, but are embracing new ways of thinking. And I would really encourage those of us that live in the accreditation world in particular to maintain connections with each other to understand how we might be able to achieve this within ourselves or broader in an interdisciplinary fashion.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for that call to figure out a way to continue this activity, this discussion across these disciplines. William, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think there are a number of positive things that I've heard in discussions today. Our colleagues in psychology have certainly been at the front line of thinking about how culture impacts the care that they provide and making sure that that is part of the curriculum that is driven in those fields. And I think it's the rest of the health professions probably need to catch up to a large degree with what they've done. I think it's also important to think about, as Kimberly spoke before, about ensuring that your site visitors, the people who go out and put your program, put your requirements into action, are also up to speed with what you're thinking. For the ACGME, many of the people who we use as field staff who do the field accreditation work for us have been people who've been schooled in older practices. They're generally a more senior group of physicians. And so to help them get up to speed before they go out and then assess the quality of the work that's being done in places that are now adopting these new requirements, I think is very important. We're finding that our field staff are very open to this and are amenable to it, but they just have to understand the sorts of things they need to look for.
Thank you so much. And Rayanne, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jackie. I really it resonated, the innovation and everything you said really definitely resonates. But several of the panelists talked about the faculty and that students need to see themselves being supported and mirrored in the faculty. Well, in dietetics, we're having a crisis of, and I'm sure we're not the only ones, have enough PhDs who are dietitians to teach our students, let alone have enough have enough underrepresented minority faculty to support these students. So I think that is one thing where we need to add, and we, making it into a small problem, we need to try to increase the level of underrepresented minority faculty in our program. But then when we do that, we're going to look to other accreditors to see how we can really elevate that part of our standards in terms of requiring faculty who do have, who are diverse to support our students.
Thank you. Thank you. And so this is going to be a question that's going to put you on the hot seat a little bit. So, I'm going to admit that right off the bat. And each of you represents an accrediting body, but what you decide has implications on the professional organizations. And so in the physical therapy or the physio world, social issues are a hot topic where we have a percentage of our membership, small may it be, that are quite vocal that they do not want to actively be involved or mandated to engage in these topics. And so what would be your advice to those professional organizations as they kind of navigate that they're on a tightrope between being member organizations and needing to maintain their membership, but then also having this commitment, this social obligation as practitioners. And so anyone want to bite at that question first?
Maybe I'll start. I see Kimberly put your hand up just as I was clicking my mic. Mine's going to be short though. We are the single accreditor of all graduate medical education. So in that role, I think we have a bit of a flex point in saying that if you don't do this, there are going to be some consequences. But I think it is important to educate people before you actually cite them as being deficient. And so I think working together with those ideas, if you're still going to be a laggard after you know how to do it, we've made it straightforward and easy for you to do it, then I think we can cite you and feel good about the process, and hopefully that it won't be a situation where we're too big to fail. That's it.
Thank you so much. Kimberly, what were your thoughts?
I guess in some ways we're in a similar situation with our professions, because with one profession we serve as the sole accreditor, and another profession they're on with our agency and another agency. So I understand those comments, but in some ways we have the opposite relationship with our professional association. Our professional association is very, very concerned with social issues. And so sometimes we have to say, wait a minute, this is our role as the accreditor, right? It's kind of the opposite to say, oh, wait a minute, we can't go, this far, because we have to make sure that, again, we are acting as an accreditor, because there are some things that are more appropriate for the professional associations to push, and we don't want to be seen as like mandating something, because as I mentioned before, accreditors are very powerful at influencing priorities. But to kind of something that Jackie said, we're also very aware that we don't want to stifle innovation. And we want to also respect the individual mission and objectives of programs, which is kind of like the hallmark, one of the kind of principles of accreditation. But we also understand there are social issues that our professional association, the profession dictates that we respond to. So it is kind of a balancing act. I think that one of the ways in which to answer your question, Lisa, is to make sure you have an open dialogue with the professional association, as well as other kind of supporting associations. Like for us, there's as I mentioned, there's an association of academic programs. So having like this ongoing conversation and making sure that you are on the same page about things, so people aren't getting mixed messages. Because again, the accreditor might say one thing, the professional association might say another, but we don't want programs with limited resources to go in 5 different directions trying to satisfy what they think one entity wants. So I think alignment is key, and just having those conversations about things. And I think, going back again to what people talked about earlier in the day, is having a common understanding and some type of common understanding of what we're talking about. Because again, you may be talking about DEI at the accreditor level, and the other organization may be talking about DEI or anti-racism in a very different vein, and it gets in mixed messages.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for talking about all the different inputs that are coming in, and the need to just have clarity about kind of the written expectations that often come from your bodies, but then also this unspoken expectation, right, that comes from the professional norms. And so thank you so much. And Jackie, we see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add one comment, and maybe the profession that I work with is unique in this aspect, but there is this professional association, which is this large body. But in addition to the professional associations, there are other organizations that are stakeholders in the process. And not to say that one stakeholder has greater rights than another or less rights than another, but to have the accrediting entity be aware of these different organizations and communicate with them when they're forming policy is one way to keep the groups all involved and also to keep one stakeholder from becoming more dominant. So, that may be something useful for folks as they begin their strategies for their own standards revision processes.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And I just want to address a comment that came over the Q&A from Robin. And Robin is one of my peers, which says, as a physical therapist, I do not experience pushback to this in my professional circle and those that I follow on social media. I can see, however, that there may be strong opinions about whether the APTA and/or CAPTE, which is our accrediting body, should contribute to this. Maybe I misunderstood what you said, Ms. Van Hoos. And Robin, I think you were spot on that depending upon the circles and where you are at, you may not be hearing this language, but I can tell you today that I was in a planning meeting for another conference of physios, and this was part of the topic in looking at the feedback from attendees to a recent conference that was held, was that they felt like we spent too much time talking about social issues that might not have been perceived as relevant to the profession. And so I do think I agree with William that there is a place for us to have a conversation, educate people that may be on the latter end of the diffusion curve, right? Because there's always early and late adopters. But overall, I do agree with you, Robin, that the physical therapy community is on board. We recently had our association accept a motion to identify the APTA to make a statement as an anti-racist organization, but we still have some work to be done. And so it is 10 to the hour, and so I'm going to ask for the chair and the vice chair to come back on. I want to thank all of our roundtable participants. Thank you so much for sharing your lessons learned, your vulnerability, and talking about where you're at in the process, and also providing information in a very transparent way that can help us all kind of grow in the process. I do want to make sure that I am respectful. Rayanne and Mary, I did not give you an opportunity to speak. Was there anything else you wanted to add? I see you both saying no. We're just going to ditto what was said. Awesome. All right. So Tanya, I'm going to pitch it back over to you.
Thank you so very much, Lisa and Miguel, and for the panelists, as well as the roundtable discussion. This was indeed powerful. We have learned a great deal about how our accreditors think about what they think about this concept of anti-racism and ways in which we can engage our program development, our curriculum development, our faculty and student development to begin thinking through what it means to eliminate racism from the health professions. My co-chair and I, Dr. Rick Baker. Rick, thank you so much for that opening, by the way. That was great. That centering was absolutely amazing. We'd like to invite all of you to our next session, which will be February 22nd. And it's entitled Exploring a Culture of Fairness, Respect, and Anti-Racism in Health Professions Education, Language Matters. Rick, do you have any words for us?
No, I think you said it perfectly. And again, this is an exciting session. It definitely fulfilled what I think we wanted to do. I don't know if we did already, but I'd like to thank the members of the committee that were able to participate today.
Absolutely. I actually think, I know that their names are on the agenda, but I'd like to actually call them out. So do you mind if we just call their names, Rick? Can we do that? Do you mind if I do that?
Yes, please.
Okay, all right. So our planning committee members, which we could not have done this without them, is Dr. Vineet Arora, who is at University of Chicago, Dr. Sherilyn Black, who is at Duke University, Dr. Hadia Guerrero, who is with the American Physical Therapy Association, Marcus Henderson. Marcus is the baby of the group and is powerful, absolutely enjoying. He's a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing. He's a doctoral student, PhD. Dr. Lynn Holden, who is at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Dr. Nadeem Karambux, who you just heard and saw him today. He's the dean at Tufts University School of Dental Medicine. Dr. Lemmy McNeely, she is on this call with us. Lemmy, if you get a moment, is Nadeem still on? Yes, Nadeem is still on too. If you guys can wave, that'd be great. And Dr. Ryan, Dr. Lemmy is with the Speech Language Pathology American Speech Language Hearing Association. It's a long stuff. And Dr. Ryan Pettaway was on here, but I think he just stepped away, and he's at Portland State University School of Public Health. So we would not have been able to do this without this amazing group and without the Global Forum staff, Patricia Cuff and Hannah Goodtree. We appreciate everyone for all of the work that's been done in this area. Again, thank you to the panelists, to our moderators, and the time is yours. Have a great rest of your day.